been having camera trouble all week, as I mentioned, and I've had to restart this video about 6 times because my cats keep interrupting me. But I wanted to get back into the 4 topics of study that aren't the physical sciences, which I recommend for science fiction and fantasy authors to research. And I've described them before as money, society, thought, and power. And today's topic is going to be society, in other words, sociology, or, as I like to put it, the study of human beings at scale. So sociology is about examining concepts that are common to most societies. Things like government, religious institutions, families, policing, the propagation of traditions, the arts, the center of society versus its fringes, and so on. And it also touches on things like individual psychology versus social constitution, what each of us is by ourselves versus what we wind up manifesting as in the bigger world, how the rest of the world sees us, how we embody the expectations of the world around us, how those things interpenetrate. Now, I am not going to be dissing psychology. I still think it's a tremendously interesting subject. I also think each of us can be reasonably good amateur psychologists because of our dealings with others face to face. It's hard not to become a good psychologist when you spend a lot of time with people in some form. But it's harder to be a sociologist. It's harder to see through the eyes of a society, or to be seeing like a state, as the title of another book put it, and that's a book that I eventually plan to talk about. Because a common question in science fiction and fantasy, and in fiction generally, is what shapes your characters? And your characters are shaped by their circumstances, their family, and beyond that, the world and the society they live in. That's a given. But how is that society itself shaped? What are the unarticulated expectations that are in it? How do those things manifest? All of those things that we take for granted in our society and that we don't really notice, that we don't always have the language to talk about, but an outsider may see it very clearly and may be able to articulate it for us, much often to our own surprise. So with sociology, one of its key concepts is something we're all pretty familiar with. It's the concept of culture, the idea that there is this matrix of ideas that exists outside any one of us individually, ideas about who we are and what we are all doing. And it has many manifestations. There's high culture, the stuff that we preserve and put in museums and study as part of the canon. There's low culture, the stuff that is fire-hosed out at us from TV. And there's subcultures and countercultures. And all of these things have places in sociological analysis. They all play different roles in terms of how they manifest in the way culture is this big push and pull. And we also have discussions in sociology about things like norms versus folkways. A norm or a mores in a society is something that has a specific moral underpinning. There's a reason for it. It's like the taboo against incest, for instance. There's purportedly a very good reason we don't do that. But a folkway, on the other hand, is something that doesn't really have that kind of underpinning. It's more like a habit. It's something that was just built up over time and is more of an eccentricity. So things like, for instance, men who kiss each other on the cheek as a form of a greeting, that's something that would be more like a folkway instead of a norm. Now, analyzing culture does come with a couple of pitfalls, and one of them is something you've probably heard of. It's called cultural relativism. In other words, it's difficult to look at other cultures on their own terms and to not be judgmental. And it's easy to say, okay, there are some cultures where clearly there is more prosperity available to other people than there are in people in other cultures. But that doesn't mean that we are studying one culture versus another culture to put one over the other. It doesn't mean we're studying them to rank them. It means we're trying to understand them, to unpack them, to see through their own eyes. And next, I think, is worth talking about is the way things move from culture to society. The way that we become a part of society through a process called socialization. The ways we interact with others through social interactions. How we deal with people and what the context is for that dealing, and how we stratify ourselves into groups. And those groups can be horizontal or vertical. They can be in groups and they can be out groups. You can see, I think, how all of this kind of discussion makes sociology a really powerful tool for world building, whether science fiction or fantasy worlds. You get to think about how things are socially in your world from a very high level on down. You have a lot of abstractions that you can apply to the way your world is built. And abstractions like those in sociological thinking are powerful tools for making sense of how your society is put together, how its people interact, how they belong to different groups, what kinds of standards are imposed on people, or what kinds of things have bubbled up spontaneously between the cracks, as it were. And both SF and fantasy, I think, benefit from these things. The more you can make your world feel like a place where its existence at scale feels real, the more immersive it's going to be when it's described, instead of when it's explained or when it's justified. Like, for instance, this is one of those things where the difference between a moire and a folkway can be useful. You want the reader to be able to sense when something is just a custom, just a piece of local color. But you also want them to be able to sense when something is a reflection of what that society says it holds dear, even if it only says that it holds that dear. And yes, those two kinds of things can intersect, but it's best to think about them independently at first. For instance, to take an example from one of the textbooks that I was consulting for this, if you have in your world men who hold hands in public when they're friends, and that's not considered to be a big deal, you could nod toward that sort of thing in a single line. You could say something like, they held hands, as any two men might. But if you have some larger statement to make about masculinity in your world and how it's regarded, it's worth knowing how those things manifest beyond mere gestures or habits. For instance, are things like honor killings okay? Or have they been pushed underground? Or now are they considered a total archaism? Are they unacceptable by any means? So when you find answers to those questions, you want those answers to be holistic. You want them to make sense in the total light of what your society values, what it's trying to do, how it thinks of itself. You want your world to be consistent. And sociology has ways of looking at society that make it easier to think about how to do that. One of the definitions that I heard about the study of sociology is that it is about the study of the tension between the individual and the society. And I think there are many books that use that as an excellent and powerful theme, and many of those are science fiction and fantasy books. And in those worlds, the society in question may be completely unfamiliar, and the individuals in those societies potentially even less familiar. But the tension between the two, the conflict between the two, that can have the kind of a flavor and the emotional resonance that we know of in our lives, that we can connect with. And so if you build a bridge between those kinds of emotional resonances, those kinds of tensions between the personal and the universal in your story, and you build a bridge from those to the tensions that we experience in our world, they become that much more real. They become that much more alive. Now, I am going at some point in the future to do videos about some specific texts and people that I want to explore in depth who are sociologists. I've talked about one of them before, a fellow named Howard S. Becker, but there are a couple of other folks I'm thinking of. Eric Hoffer, there's another guy that I covered previously. He was an amateur sociologist. He was never formally trained, but he was very talented and enormously erudite. He's the one who wrote The True Believer. Again, that was a previous thing that I talked about. He has quite a few other books that I'm going to unpack at some point. And then you have some of the giants in the field. You have men like Irving Goffman and C. Wright Mills. And then you have, again, another maverick that I really want to touch on at some point, a gentleman named Paul Goodman. His life was a mixture of social activism, scholarship, and sociology. And his work is getting a long overdue reissue and reappreciation these days. So he's somebody I want to dive back into because I think he has a tremendous amount to relate to science fiction and fantasy creators who want to do social commentary in their work. So what's a good textbook for sociology? Well, one of them is another offering from the OpenStax curriculum, OpenStax Sociology 3rd edition. This is, again, a wonderful resource because it's completely free. It's very professionally edited and put together. And you can read the whole thing online, or you can buy a paper copy from Amazon, whatever works for you. Another good one, if you just want to dive in fast, is a book called Sociology, a very short introduction, and it is from the series of very short introduction books, which are all pretty good, actually. So this one I also recommend if you just want to get the quick overview. So once again, a big reason for studying sociology, and even in only a miniature form, if you're a science fiction and fantasy writer, is it gives you world-building tools of a class that you're not going to have in almost any other form. It gives you ways to see like a society. And when you're writing about a society that doesn't even exist, that's even more powerful. So see what you think.